Dr. Dan's Freedom Forum is on the air.
Good evening. This is Dr. Dan, and this is Freedom Forum Live, streamed Tuesday evenings at 8 p.m. Eastern on Facebook, YouTube, X, and Rumble. Tonight, life, liberty, and property, rediscovering our heritage. 250 years ago, with great trepidation and even greater courage, our founders declared their independence from Great Britain. In the Declaration of Independence, largely written by Thomas Jefferson, they stated their grievances against King George, demanded redress, and outlined the philosophy that would be enshrined in our Constitution and the Bill of Rights. Our constitutional republic was originally created to protect and secure the natural law rights of each individual, even a minority of one single person. All it required for elected officials and politicians was adherence to the written word of the Constitution and acceptance of basic moral law. That system has now been corrupted to give those consumed by greed and a lust for power control of the machinery of government for their own self-serving and immoral purposes. The concentration of government power has been allowed to grow exponentially, compromising the rights of the individual. It is always about money and power. International corporations and the wealthy elite purchase the votes of legislators and bureaucrats to advance their agenda of control and self-enrichment. If you have ultimate decision-making authority in your own life, you're free. People who are free, who consider themselves to be free, generally expect to be left alone to chart their own course in life. Live and let live. Control is the essence of government. It's raison d'etre. There was a time when holding public office was considered a service to the community and your fellow citizens. Now it is a career choice that requires compromise with the moral principles of self-government to get elected and remain in power. When the cost of getting elected far exceeds the salary of the office you seek, understand that the dollar difference goes to purchase influence and votes for the agendas of high dollar contributors. Yes, that is the story, is it not? And that's why we're here tonight, to discuss these kind of issues. So here is the truth, as I see it. We are clearly disregarding the lessons of history, despite multiple warnings about the dire consequences of doing so. While we ignore history's teachings, evil listens and learns from our mistakes. Evil never sleeps. We can pray for divine intervention, but patiently waiting for deliverance is not a winning strategy. I truly believe that God expects each of us to become a warrior for morality and individual freedom. My guest on Freedom Forum Live is Nathan Bushmaker. Nathan and his family raise registered feeder calves in central Montana. Nathan is a research specialist and policy analyst specializing in historical policy research, technical writing, and advocacy for property rights. Nathan, welcome as a guest on Freedom Forum Radio.
Yeah. Thank you, Dan, for having me on. It's been a long time coming, so glad I'm on.
Well, Nathan, we've known each other for a long time. We speak at least once a month, if not more. And I've been remiss in not demanding that you be on because I know you are a treasure trove of information and you have a lot to say about many things. So why don't we start off? What is the base? What's the foundation of our government, of our nation? Where does that all come from?
Yeah. Well, I mean, good lead in an introduction, just laying out kind of an overview of what the Declaration was and the Constitution and what our founders established in government. But the foundation, the object of government or good government is life, liberty, and property of the individual. Because it's ultimately individuals who comprise society who create government to begin with, especially in the context of the American Republic. But life, liberty, and property are essential. That's the body, soul, and spirit of civic man. Life, liberty, and property not only is the object of government, it's also, you mentioned morality. It's the object of God's moral law and commandments that were placed into stone and given to Moses on Sinai. So, because all the commandments of God in the Ten Commandments, for instance, correspond to, besides the ones that are directly in reference to God, like the first one, have no other gods before me, they all correspond to the life, liberty, and property of our fellow man. For instance, the establishment of private property in the negative is thou shalt not steal, which very directly implies something that doesn't belong to me and belongs to another. And then obviously a law that forbids me from taking that from that individual. So the roots of government and our system of government in particular tie into, I think, those theological foundations, just a whole unbroken continuity of historical record leading up to our Declaration and the Constitution and then our nation since then. But in more recent history than ancient is just the common law heritage through England primarily, but other European countries from the late 1800s or 800s clear up forward. Like the 900s, you have the Dooms of King Alfred. You get into the 1200s, 1215, you have Magna Carta. 1420, you have the Articles of Prague. 1600s, you have the English Civil War. You have the English Bill of Rights. And then a century after that, you have the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. And I think it's very important to understand the progression that came up to the founding of the United States of America, because some people teach it, in educational academia, that this was this new experiment. It came out of the Enlightenment, and we're just going to try this out. It was unique circumstances in the founding of this nation. But our founders looked to long established first principles and common law heritage that, like I said, goes back to the 900s. Well, arguably back to the self-governing system of ancient Israel before they begged for a king as well. So I just wanted to say that there's a foreground of a lot of fascinating history and martyrs and men and women who really laid down everything, their lives, their life, liberty, and property, with the hope that their posterity, their children and their children's children would be able to govern their own affairs without arbitrary interference with the things that pertain to their life, their liberty, and their property. And so to our present day, 250 years in since the Declaration of Independence, and as you noted in your introduction, we've drifted sadly a long ways away from the limitations and the intentions of our founders with those original documents, which were intended to nail government down in such a way that we can govern our own affairs and are protected in our life, liberty, and property. And government ultimately is a force to protect us in those interests, not to regulate it.
I think it's important to understand that when Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, his phrase was life, liberty, and property, not the pursuit of happiness. It was life, liberty, and property because he understood that if you own property, you have a stake in what you are forming. And his desire was that in order to participate in terms of voting and things like that, you had to be a property owner for obvious reasons, because once you own property, you're part of the deal. You're part of the ownership group that therefore you have a right to make decisions because you are part of the owners of the enterprise. It's not like you're sitting on the outside with, no skin in the game at all. He wanted people to have skin in the game in order to make decisions. And that's the importance of property, is that is your skin in the game, the ownership of property. Wouldn't you say?
100%, Dan. And that's actually perfect in stating that, because we often think Declaration of Independence, Constitution, our founders did this, but we forget there was the Western expansion across the Western territories with the Louisiana Purchase and all those things that unfolded. And our founders, in their brilliance, that ties into what you just said, they differed from sovereigns of antiquity who retained all, resources and real estate under their thumb and basically controlled the people. Our early Congresses, and Jefferson and Louisiana Purchase, they had a land disposal framework to dispose of the Western territories, first by creating distinct Republican states, where they allowed, as soon as certain population thresholds were attained within the territory, those people could come together, draft a constitution of their own, submitted to the Congress in application for statehood through the enabling legislation. So our founders, it's brilliant when you think about it. That's what they did when they broke with England and established the nation. They drafted a constitution by which the nation was to be governed, and all the individual states had their own constitutions as well. And then they replicated that across the Western territory by creating distinct Republican states with equal rights and immunity as the former states. And then the other thing they did is they disposed of much of the real estate to private appropriation, where there's your skin in the game. And I believe Jefferson, because even in the early years of our nation, they were already seeing the centralizing power of the executive and the judicial branches of government. And I believe Jefferson and the early Congresses believed that the most decentralizing effect that you can have on Washington is by populating the Western territories with hundreds of thousands of individual sovereigns with equal rights and immunities under the law, and give them full title and possession to the land that they cultivate, inhabit, and those deeds and those lands were transferred to those individuals. Nothing, you have no example paralleling that. And talk about economic stimulus to a brand new nation, of opening up that kind of opportunity to industrious men who wanted to simply go out, be left alone, till the land, and provide for their family and take care of their neighbors.
Well, Nathan, that was, and I know I love history like you do. I think history, the knowledge of history, is so enlightening. Our country was a dramatic break from the feudal system of Europe and Great Britain. For centuries, nobody owned land except dukes, duchesses, kings, queens, and all that royalty business. The guy who owned the castle owned the land. If you lived around him, you paid rent. His only duty was protect you from marauding people who came and who had wars with them. But you didn't own anything. What did you own? You may own the sword, a pot, a pan, maybe a donkey, a cart. But you had to pay heavy taxes for the privilege of existing on his land, not your land, his land. And America was a dramatic break from that feudal culture. It's what made us free individuals. Isn't that right?
Absolutely. And it's the division of property. And I would submit that a people and civilization cannot attain to liberty um, without that realization. That is individual liberty. And you mentioned that earlier of the rights of the individual. And with all this stuff with DEI and minority and group politics and everything we see today, the only minority our constitutional republic and good governance and righteous law acknowledges is the individual person. And so yeah, the problem with group politics and everything else, I'm not trying to take the conversation down that road because I don't want to go there, but that's one of the problems there. And it's true with back to land, that's the same effort there, is to recollectivize land ownership. And that's what's interesting about where we are today in the country is, you have this astounding policy of our forefathers of land disposal and appropriation to individuals, statehood, all intended to facilitate self-government. And by the way, that's a part of the federalist system that our founders envisioned. And federalism represents a diffusion of sovereign authority and power. And having sovereign and independent states are crucial because those serve as checks on the federal government when it's not functioning within the domain that's allocated to it by the Constitution, and vice versa. And you can boil that down to even clear down to the county level and boroughs. And obviously, as we said, the individual person and his property. And the old world in England, you mentioned, with the royal prerogative and kings and how they ruled over things. Even in the midst of that, though, we see instances of efforts to break away from that all through English history. I mentioned the Magna Carta as one instance of that, where King John was cornered on fields of Runnymede and basically forced to sign the charter. I call it a mercy document because if he wouldn't have signed it, they basically would have took his head right there. But that was, instrumental, and our founders leaned heavily on many of those early freedom documents, even though it wasn't fully realized in the way it was in America, the common law structures of England. Nonetheless, that common law structure and heritage goes back through those centuries, and it prevailed in England more than the other European countries for two reasons. One, because it was an island and cut off from the mainland, and two, because they had the land laws that went back hundreds of years. So they were able to push back against the Roman civil law structures and maintain a common law framework. And that's why some historians have said that our founders were more English than the English. Because if you read the discourses between the Continental Congress and the King in England and the Parliament, our founders were not initially trying to break with England. They were essentially appealing for redress as Englishmen and making the case that they were being robbed of those rights. And that's a good case example for us today as well, because they laid the pattern of lawful Christian resistance to unlawful government. And that is petition for redress. You use all lawful and non-violent mechanisms to try to right wrongs. If that's to no avail, flee, go to some other jurisdiction, country or borough or county that respects your God-given rights. And if that's not available and you're in a corner, you have the right lawfully with force, not vigilante, but in a collective, professional government context to protect ultimately your life and limb, to take up arms to safeguard liberty. So that's the pattern our founders laid, and that's where we're at now. Is we need to petition for redress and try to right wrongs.
Well, one of the things you mentioned, which I think is important to talk about, and that is DEI and group identity. Those two things are a direct assault on individual rights, because that's what collectivists want to do. They want to replace individual rights with group rights. The UN Charter is filled with all kinds of articles about group rights. It's a communist document written by communists like Alger Hiss, and all they want is group rights. And if they foster group rights in our country, then we kind of lose all of that individual rights that you and I know are so important. Because if you start looking at only group rights, then you start digressing into democracies, which is mob rule, as opposed to a constitutional republic. So that is one of the tricks, if you will, of the socialist left. They want everyone to identify as a member of a group, not as an individual. And that's what and it's only property rights. When you say, I'm not a member of the group, I have rights because I own property. That's what sets you apart.
Exactly. And I would just add too that property is much more, I've been mentioning land and disposal and appropriation of lands, and that is property. But property is also much broader than that. Property involves a whole host of things that relate to your person and your life, which includes your thoughts, your intellectual property, um, all individual possessions, your person, you as an individual, constitutes your property in your life. And it's not a question of how much or how little somebody has, but what they lawfully acquire is theirs, and it's to be protected from theft and arbitrary violation or taking. And we have this well, back to the group. That's the problem, and you're 100% right. The group ideology is rampant in all sorts of areas. These states like Washington and California, Oregon, some East Coast states, and even Colorado, the group politics and all of that is taking over in such a way that common sense is just totally out the window. And rather than protecting individuals in their life, their liberty, and their property, individuals sadly are being violated in those things. And with that said, I want to read, this is a perfect quote, because the second most cited document by the framers of our founding documents was William Blackstone's Commentaries on the Laws of England. And in book 1, he deals with what he calls the first book is on the rights of persons. And in this work, he goes through 3 different criteria: life, liberty, property, and breaks that down. And in this work, he says, so great, moreover, is the regard of the law for private property that it will not authorize the least violation of it, not even for the general good of the whole community. In vain may it be urged that the good of the individual ought to yield to that of the community, for it would be dangerous to allow any private man or even any public tribunal to be the judge of this common good and to decide whether it be expedient or not. Besides, the public good is in nothing more essentially interested than in the protection of every individual's private rights as modeled by the municipal law. He lays that out crystal clear. And another way to put that is the public interest doesn't trump individual rights. It's the other way around, based on our common law heritage. Very important to understand that.
And that really is what one of the major battles that we're fighting today, is that politicians want to corral us into groups so they can take away our rights. That is the whole purpose of all of that stuff. That it all started, it started with a lot of ways, but when we started, one of the things that aggravates me the most are hyphenated Americans, that whole concept. My family, most of my ancestors came to this country around 1900. They came from oppressed places in Europe. They came to this country. They had only one desire. They went to work. They went to night school to learn English. They became United States citizens, and they only wanted to be called Americans. No hyphenization. The hyphenization is a way of separating people out into groups. And from a political perspective, why is this group identity so important to politicians? Because that's how they can steal from one group to get elected themselves, and then also have groups that are fighting each other. I look at it like a salad bowl. We used to be a melting pot. Yeah, and I know you've heard that phrase. When my ancestors came to this country, it was a melting pot. You know, that means that all the flavors went into a melting pot, and that pot was the flavor of America. But you could not tell the individual flavors. It was one flavor that was all of us. Now now we're a salad bowl. And what happens is the politician says, well, there's not too many onions in here, but there's a lot of lettuce. So if I take something away from the onions and give it to the lettuce, man, I'm going to get a whole bunch of votes. There are not enough onions in there to really harm me. And so then the onions say, well, my God, he gave all that to the lettuce. Why aren't we getting it? It's those darn lettuce people. They're the ones who made him do it. And so that's why we're in the state we're in today. We're fighting each other because we're being used and abused by politicians in exactly that way.
Yeah. Well, exactly. And then they brainwash everybody through academia, and that goes back to the Frankfurt School and everything, where this critical theory stuff that it's no longer just studying sociology or different things, you know, just from a historical or academic perspective. They have to, and it's dangerous too, because that actually leads to what we're seeing, which is like reverse racism and racism in different directions. In Europe, it's just, you know, I mentioned our English common law heritage that goes back, you know, to the 900s in England. You know, it breaks my heart. I've never even been to England, but a vast amount of my studies in the last 6-7 years has been common law heritage and many English martyrs and patriots through time and history. And then you look at what's happening in the United Kingdom and Scotland and Ireland and England, and it's just like where their own people in their own homeland are basically being subjugated by a foreign invading population, being hoisted and defended by their own governing officials. I mean, it's just, and this is the seat of the Western world for civilization and some of the great advances to pull man out of poverty. All that originated in England, and you know, those early scientists. And obviously we expanded that in America, but it's saddening that that's where that's come to, you know. And that's where the theological application comes in. You know, when you turn away from God and you no longer adhere to his commands, that's what happens. It's not just, oh, these bad foreigners are coming in. I think we need to really step back and look at where we are as a people, because where the Spirit is, there is liberty. And if we're not going back to the old paths, if we're not in line with the ordinances and the statutes and the laws that our founders held to, which was ultimately God's law found in his scriptures and the word and the gospel, that's really the crux of it, is if we can maintain that as a people. And this may boil down to, we may not be able to do that in a national context anymore, but I believe we very well can do that at a state or local. And it always starts local, bottom up anyways. If you want to start a fire, you got to start with kindling wood. And maybe the backlog of unconverted Christians in this country will finally wake up to their personal responsibility in this life. Yeah, Jesus is coming, but in the interim, we have a responsibility of dominion, serving and loving our neighbor, and that involves protecting our neighbor. the commandment not to kill our neighbor is to not also suffer our neighbor to be killed or to be robbed. It's responsibility in all of that.
Well, when you obviously look at the founders, they were devout Christians and they understood moral law. They were moral people. And they understood that in order to maintain a constitutional republic, that what they designed, you had to have people who understood right from wrong, morally, moral law. That's right from wrong. The very, very basis. We are so far departed from that. I cannot imagine. I cannot imagine the immorality that has overtaken this country, and that is really the basis of what's going on here right now, is it not?
Well, it's a big part of it, and it's always an assault on the home and the family, which is the germ seed of civilization, and it's a support system for the individual. But the immorality, and that's what I'm getting to, is that's a byproduct and a symptom of a bigger issue. And we've allowed encroachment in all these areas, partly by being disconnected to our heritage, hence the title Life, Liberty, and Property, Rediscovering Our Heritage. And the Marxists know this. That's why Antonio Gramsci in his Prison Diaries said that we will never, communism will never overtake Western civilization because the Christian ethic is so entrenched. But then he went on and said, we need to take a long march through the institutions to sever people from their heritage. So my response to that is we need to stay connected to our heritage. If we don't want to become commies in a gridlock, centrally planned economic framework that leaves no individual liberty at the end of the day, we need to exercise self-government. We need to take responsibility. And that involves, back to the commandments, God, one of them, honor your mother and your father. I had the privilege and honor the other day to witness, my grandparents are still alive, and I just was able to spend an evening with them and their 4 sons, one of which is my father, and celebrate their 69th wedding anniversary. Long time. And the biblical commandment, honor your father and your mother, is the first commandment with a promise. Honor your father and your mother so that you may live long in the land that your God has given thee to live in. So that's an encouragement to me. And we're trying to, shoes too big for my feet, but as a young man, we're trying to fill those shoes and carry forward that multi-generational battle. We're in the cattle industry. We raise cattle in Montana. All of that was a framework laid up in sacrifice and generational mindset of my great grandma and grandpa, and then them. But I just looped that in because that literally just happened. And, we need to get back to the basics in those respects. And the church is culpable in this. The things the church in our day tolerates, secular America wouldn't have tolerated 30, 40 years ago. And that's a real telltale sign of how far we've gone in the boiling water or the slow simmer to a boil in our culture and society. But the question ultimately is, Dan, what do we do about it as individuals? And that's where my passion is. And that's why I love history, because that's how you connect to your heritage. You connect with the people and the men and women. It's Hebrews 11, the great cloud of witnesses who went before us and laid down that example, some of which at extreme cost. We haven't suffered the bloodshed yet, many of us, especially in the West. It's starting to happen, like back to England and stuff. But my view is we shouldn't, if we're being salt and light and taking responsibility as we ought to be, honoring our mother and our father, taking on the generational battle, staying connected to our heritage. Vance Havner used to say, God has made of us the salt of the world to rub us into the carcass of a decaying civilization. And that's our duty.
Well, you've said it very well, Dathan, because I agree that the church in many ways has let us all down. I go to church. I visit a lot of churches because I like to see what different different churches are doing. My preference is for small rural churches. It's like a family. Some of these big mega churches, they leave me cold. And I would imagine they accept things in order to pay their mortgages and the like that small churches do not. And I agree with you that that is the foundation that we need to rebuild. It's crumbling. That Christian foundation, the knowledge of these things are right and those things are evil and wrong. That is the type of lesson that our children are not learning. They're not hearing. Many of them are not. It depends upon the parents whether they expose their children to those kind of lessons, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I think parents is a big deal. Obviously, they're not getting it in our schools, except for in maybe rare instances. There are some good teachers that do their own homework and teach curriculum and don't just take what comes down from the NEA or whatever. But so parents play a big role in that. Back to our founders, and I think a Christian ethic that needs to be understood is the doctrine of human depravity. The brilliance of our founders designed is they had a healthy self-suspicion of even themselves. They understood that even the best of us in positions of power are corruptible. That is the key ingredient that makes for a system of self-government and limitations of any delegation of government or power. Because all human power and authority ultimately at the end of the day is limited. That's why we have due process, the jury of your peers, all these checks and balances. All of those are recognitions of the limitations of human judgment, because all righteous judgment requires certainty. And that's why a reasonable doubt allows the acquittal of a criminal defendant, because it's better for 10 guilty persons to go free than one innocent man be incarcerated. Those are common law precepts, and those are rooted in Christian principles. But you were not taught that in, Sunday school or most churches. And that's the irony too. The quote unquote Protestant church have no protest. They just, of all the church and congregations, the Protestant churches, it's the Protestant church and through the English Civil War and through 2 centuries that broke with Roman civil law and laid those foundations, much of which our founders deeply relied upon. Thomas Hooker established Connecticut and Hartford with a sermon that laid out a constitutional framework of governance 100 years before the English Enlightenment, by the way, and the Scottish Enlightenment. There was 200 years of self-government in colonial America before the Declaration of Independence. And where did they get the concepts of self-government and private property rights, life, liberty, and property? It came from their pastor, who instructed them in the laws of God, and they then applied it to all of life. And the ones who drafted the Declaration of Independence and codified the federal Constitution gleaned from those early years. That was actually why England was coming against our founders in the colonies, because they didn't like the concept of self-government and how well the colonies were doing. They felt that was taking away from the royal prerogative, and they hoisted the power of the crown and parliament against the colonies, which, as we know, ultimately led to unbearable circumstances, to which our founders took up arms and said, we've had enough, and we will sever ourselves from the homeland and establish a government that secures the rights of life, liberty, and property. So the Declaration of Independence, we find these truths to be sacred and undeniable, that governments, that we find these truths to be, I said it wrong.
Self-evident.
I said it the way Jefferson originally wrote it. We find these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal with certain unalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. And then governments are instituted among men to preserve those rights. And when government deviates, the people, as the aggregation of sovereignty, have the right to absolve the bands of that government and reestablish a government that serves those ends. So the Declaration of Independence lays the framework and even codifies lawful resistance to unlawful government. It's all there.
What's funny to me, not funny actually, is the Protestantism was a protest movement. And when COVID came and the government said, close your churches, they just complied. I thought that was one of the worst things that I have seen. That should have been an instantaneous uprising of churches saying, no, we will not comply with that. That would have been true Protestantism.
Yeah, I agree. And, as you know, there were some that did stand. John MacArthur, one of them, some pastors in Canada. But yeah, it's that was a litmus test, not only for the churches in this country, but for a lot of people. And it's easy. It wasn't even that long ago how crazy of what was implemented and pushed. But the failure on the part of the silence and some of that, and that's, we can't go too far down that path, but the problem there is false interpretations and understanding of Romans 13 and other passages that many have taken and applied in such a way that just promotes blind submission, which the Bible never lays out total blind submission. We are to be submissive to lawful authority, even unrighteous men who exercise lawful authority. We're to be generally submissive to, but there's clear lines. And when it comes to the church is an independent, sovereign jurisdictional domain that the government has no power whatsoever over, if you read the First Amendment. So we need to remember that. And if we don't stand on those rights and exercise those rights, it becomes an empty shell.
So Nathan, we've discussed the foundations of our government. We've sort of discussed a lot of the things that have gone wrong. Where do you think we go from here? What is the proper course at this point?
Yeah. Well, it's kind of a packed question. Generally, a simple motto that I try to live by, when my stepfather passed away about 13 years ago now, and I took on his ranch estate, way too big of shoes for my feet. And I wasn't sure where that was leading, but that's been the motto of that and all my professional work and just my life is the only way to guarantee what God has for me tomorrow is to do what he's called me to do today. So from an individual level, it starts with just individual responsibility. It's not that difficult. You don't have to be some genius or a bookworm and know everything about history or this or that, but you do need to study. You need to learn where you came from. You need to understand the law, God's law, the word, and do what's right. Exercise righteousness in your capacity. And it's difficult. Human relations are difficult. But that's where the rubber meets the road. So just interpersonally in your family and life, try to be salt and light. And I'm not saying just this fluffy love and just get along with everybody. That includes reproof and correction when necessary. And I think we just need more young people. I'm hoping, and I'm seeing it, more young people that are returning to the old paths, going back to first principles, that love liberty and want to preserve it for their kids. So there's many mechanisms of moving forward and applying that depending on where you are in the nation and in the world. But that's what I would say is don't be governed by interests. Be governed by principles, because dupes give into interest, patriots adhere to principles. So if you don't know what principles are, you can find them in the scriptures. You can find them repeated all through common law history. And life, liberty, property is an aggregate of that. We need to know where we come from as a people, and we need to be willing, even in the face of opposition around us, to state the truth, to speak the truth. And it'll be tougher. The longer we go without doing it, the harder it's going to be to do it.
What you're really talking about, Nathan, is kind of self-enlightenment. It's up to individuals to gain the knowledge they need to understand where we came from, how we got where we are now, and what we have to do to right the course of the ship of state. It's really a self-enlightenment process. Learn these things. Learn where we were, how we got to where we are, and now what do I, as a personal person, have to do in order to do my part to put America back on the right course? We can't sit on the couch anymore. Those of us with knowledge, those of us with a knowledge of history, those of us that have talents, can speak, and can enlighten others. It's time to get off the sofa, wouldn't you say?
Agreed, Dan. 100%.
So we're getting off the sofa, you and I. What else would you like to tell people?
Well, I just want to thank you, Dan, for taking the time, the invitation to come on the program. This is a topic I've wanted to kind of touch on, and maybe we can have round 2 coming up and circle back on some of these things moving forward. But yeah, I appreciate it. Just love where we do come from and the opportunities we do have. The foundations aren't totally gone yet, so I think we're duty bound to the degree we're in our individual capacity, we're to do what we can do, and with God's help, that's what I'm trying to do. And so gonna keep fighting the good fight.
Absolutely, Nathan. And I think you and I will do it together. And I expect that you and I will influence others, because I'm not going to keep my mouth shut, and neither will you. God bless you, my friend, and thank you for being a guest talking with me tonight. It was a great pleasure.
Same to you, Dan. Have a good night.